The Ice Trap, The Impossible Voyage of Shackleton. Prologue. The Advertisement. London, 1913. Legend has it that Sir Ernest Shackleton placed an advertisement in a London newspaper to recruit men for his upcoming expedition. It read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Whether the ad is real or apocryphal, the sentiment was true. 5,000 men applied. Shackleton chose 27. They were a mix of sailors, scientists, and rugged adventurers. There was Frank Worsley, a genius navigator who could find his way by the stars while standing on a heaving deck. There was Tom Crean, a giant Irishman made of iron muscle and grit. There was Frank Hurley, a photographer determined to capture the end of the world. Their goal was audacious: to cross the continent of Antarctica on foot. They didn't know that they would never even touch the continent. They didn't know that their ship would be crushed like a matchbox. They didn't know they would spend 2 years living on floating ice, drifting into the most dangerous ocean on Earth. This is the story of how 28 men entered the White Hell and, against all logic, physics, and probability, refused to die. Chapter 1. The Wooden Beast. August 1914. Plymouth, England. The ship was named Endurance. She was a masterpiece of shipbuilding. Designed solely for the ice, she was built of Norwegian fir, oak, and greenheart. Her hull was 30 inches thick in places, solid wood designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the polar pack ice. She was rigged as a barkentine, sails, but possessed a coal-fired steam engine. As she prepared to leave, the world was falling apart. World War I had just broken out. Germany had invaded Belgium. Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the British Admiralty for the war effort. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sent back a one-word telegram: "Proceed." So, while Europe marched into the trenches of the Somme, the Endurance sailed south. They stopped in Buenos Aires, then South Georgia Island, a desolate whaling outpost at the bottom of the Atlantic. The Norwegian whalers there, men who knew the Antarctic waters better than anyone, gave Shackleton a grim warning. "The ice is bad this year. The Weddell Sea is choked. Do not go." Shackleton listened, but he could not stop. He was an explorer of the heroic age. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance left the last outpost of civilization and headed into the Southern Ocean. Chapter 2. The White Teeth. January 1915. The Weddell Sea. The Endurance fought her way south. For weeks she acted as a battering ram. The method was violent. The captain, Frank Worsley, would spot a crack in the ice pack. He would signal the engine room, "Full speed ahead." The 300-ton ship would slam into the ice. The ship would shudder, rear up onto the ice floe, and then crush it with its weight. Crash, grind, break. They pushed deeper and deeper toward the continent. They were only 80 miles from land. They could see the white cliffs of the Vassel Bay. But the wind changed. A northerly gale began to blow. It pushed the loose ice pack tight against the continent. The leads, channels of open water, began to close. On January 18, 1915, the ice stopped moving. It solidified around the ship. The ship was no longer a ship. It was a winter station. They were drifting with the ice, moving north, away from their destination. Chapter 3. The Long Night. May 1915. The Antarctic winter is not like winter anywhere else. The sun sets in May and does not rise again until August. For months, the Endurance drifted in total darkness. Shackleton knew that the greatest danger wasn't the cold, it was the mind. If the men lost hope, they would die. He kept a strict routine. He organized football games on the ice in the twilight. He held dog sled races. In the evenings, they sang songs and put on skits in the wardroom. Frank Hurley, the photographer, climbed the rigging in the pitch black, using magnesium flares to take ghostly photographs of the ship trapped in the ice. Images that look like a spaceship stranded on a frozen planet. But outside, the pressure was building. The ice of the Weddell Sea is not static. It is a shifting, grinding tectonic plate. Millions of tons of ice were pressing against the hull of the ship. At night, the men would lie in their bunks and listen to the ice screaming. It sounded like trains colliding or heavy artillery fire. The ship would groan and pop as the timbers were squeezed. "It's like being in a giant vise," one sailor wrote in his diary, "and someone is slowly turning the handle." Chapter 4. The Death Scream. October 1915. The sun returned, but it brought no warmth. It brought the pressure waves. The ice began to buckle. Giant ridges of ice 10 feet high rose up around the ship. The Endurance was lifted out of the water, leaning at a terrifying 30-degree angle. On October 24, the attack began. A massive pressure ridge grabbed the stern, back of the ship and the bow, front, and began to bend the ship. The sound was deafening. The 30-inch beams snapped like carrots. The deck buckled. Water began to pour into the engine room. Shackleton stood on the leaning deck. He looked at his ship, his dream, his fortune. "She's going, boys," he said softly. He gave the order, "Abandon ship." The men scrambled onto the ice. They unloaded the dogs, the sledges, the food supplies, and the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. They set up tents on the frozen ocean floe, a safe distance from the dying ship. That night, under the eerie light of the Aurora Australis, they watched the death of the Endurance. The ice crushed the hull completely. The rigging tangled. With a final sickening groan, the ship slipped beneath the ice. They were alone. The situation. They were 1,200 miles from civilization. They had no radio. No one in the world knew they were in trouble. They were camping on a piece of ice that was less than 6 feet thick, floating over 10,000 feet of dark ocean. They had limited food. It was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Chapter 5. Ocean Camp. November to December 1915. Shackleton reinvented himself. He was no longer an explorer. He was a survivor. His primary goal was to keep 27 men alive. He realized he had to assert control. He ordered that all personal items be discarded to save weight. He threw his own gold watch and gold cigarette case into the snow to set an example. "We travel light," he said. There was one exception. He allowed Leonard Hussey to keep his banjo. "We need the music," Shackleton said. "It is mental medicine." They tried to march across the ice toward land. It was a disaster. The ice was a chaotic maze of pressure ridges and soft snow. They dragged the heavy lifeboats for 7 days and only moved 7 miles. Shackleton called a halt. "It's no use," he said. "We camp here. We drift with the ice." They called it Ocean Camp, then later moved to Patience Camp. For 5 months they lived on the ice floe. They ate penguin and seal meat. They used blubber for fuel to melt ice for water. Their clothes were soaked with grease and soot. But the food began to run out. The seals migrated away. The rations got smaller. And then the dogs. They had loved the sled dogs. But the dogs required a pound of meat a day. The men couldn't spare it. One by one, the dogs were taken behind an ice ridge and shot. Then, in the ultimate act of desperation, the men butchered the dogs and ate them.
Chapter 6. The Ice Breaks. April 1916. The ice floe they were living on was melting. It was shrinking. They could feel the ocean swell lifting the ice beneath their sleeping bags. The floe cracked through the middle of the camp. One night, a crack opened directly under a tent. A sailor fell into the freezing water. Shackleton lunged and pulled him out just as the two massive blocks of ice slammed back together. If he had been a second later, the man would have been crushed to pulp. On April 9th, the ice broke apart completely. They were surrounded by open water. "Launch the boats!" Shackleton roared. The 28 men piled into the 3 small open lifeboats. They pushed off into the Weddell Sea. This was not a calm ocean. They were rowing through a mixmaster of churning ice chunks and freezing waves. They were aiming for Elephant Island, a desolate rock about 100 miles away. For 7 days, they battled the ocean in open boats. They were soaked to the skin. The temperature was 0. They couldn't sleep because the spray froze instantly on their clothes, turning them into suits of armor. The thirst was worse than the cold. They had run out of fresh water. Their tongues swelled in their mouths. On the 7th day, through the mist, they saw black cliffs, Elephant Island. They surfed the boats through the jagged reefs and crashed onto a stony beach. They crawled onto the shore. They were the first humans ever to set foot on Elephant Island. They fell to their knees and drank from a glacial stream. They laughed, they cried, they hugged the rocks. They were on land. But their joy was short-lived. Elephant Island was a dead end. It was far outside the shipping lanes. No ship would ever pass by. There were no animals there in winter. If they stayed, they would starve. Shackleton looked at the ocean. He looked at his exhausted men. He knew there was only one chance. He had to take one of the small lifeboats, the James C. Card, and sail it across the wildest stretch of ocean on the planet to South Georgia Island. It was a voyage of 800 miles through the Drake Passage in winter in a 22-foot boat. "It is impossible," Worsley said. "It is our only hope," Shackleton replied. Chapter 7. The Voyage of the James Card. April 24, 1916. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him: Worsley, the navigator; Crean, the giant; McNeish, the carpenter; McCarthy, and Vincent. The other 22 men would stay behind on Elephant Island under the command of Frank Wild, living under the 2 overturned remaining boats. The carpenter, Harry McNeish, raised the sides of the James Card using scraps of wood and canvas. He sealed the seams with seal blood and oil paint. They loaded rocks for ballast. They pushed the boat into the surf. The men on the beach gave 3 raspy cheers. The James Card disappeared into the gray fog. What followed is considered the greatest small boat journey in maritime history. For 16 days, they fought a hurricane. The waves were 60 feet high, Cape Horn rollers. The boat was tossed like a cork. They were constantly bailing water. The ice built up on the rigging so thick that the boat became top-heavy. They had to crawl out onto the slippery, pitching deck with axes to chop the ice away, knowing that one slip meant death.
Worsley navigated with a sextant, but the sky was overcast. He had to guess their position. If his calculation was off by even 1 degree, they would miss the island and be swept out into the endless Atlantic to die. On the 7th night, Shackleton saw a line of white clearing in the sky. "The weather is breaking," he shouted. Then he realized it wasn't the sky. It was the white foam of a rogue wave, a tidal wave stretching horizon to horizon. "Hold on! For God's sakes, hold on!" he screamed. The wave struck them. The boat was buried underwater. For an eternity they were submerged. Then, miraculously, the card shuddered and rose to the surface, half filled with water. They bailed for their lives. On May 8th, through a break in the storm, they saw black peaks, South Georgia. But the hurricane wasn't done. It blew them toward the cliffs. For 2 days they rode out the storm just offshore, listening to the waves smashing against the rocks that would shred their boat. Finally, the wind shifted, and they steered into a small inlet called King Haakon Bay. They crashed onto the beach. They dragged the boat up. They collapsed. They had done the impossible. But there was a cruel twist. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations and the ships were on the north side. Between them lay the interior of South Georgia, a jagged spine of glaciers and mountains that had never been crossed by human beings. The boat was too damaged to sail around. They had to walk.
The Mountains of Madness, Chapter 8, The Screws in the Boots. May 19th, 1916. King Haakon Bay, South Georgia. McNeish, Vincent, and McCarthy were finished. They were physically broken men, unable to walk. They collapsed under the upturned hull of the James C. Caird. Shackleton looked at Frank Worsley and Tom Crean. "We have to go," he said. They were the A-team. Worsley, the navigator. Crean, the unstoppable Irishman, and Shackleton, the boss. They had no climbing gear. They had no tent. They had no sleeping bags. If they stopped to sleep in the high mountains, they would freeze to death. They had to march non-stop. They prepared their gear. They took a carpenter's adze, a tool for smoothing wood, to use as an ice axe. They took 50 feet of rope. And then, a stroke of genius. Shackleton pulled the brass screws out of the lifeboat itself. They drove the screws through the soles of their rotting leather boots. These were their makeshift crampons, the only grip they would have on the blue ice of the glaciers. At 3 a.m., under a full moon, they began to climb. They ascended into a landscape of jagged peaks and crevices. Fog rolled in, obscuring the drops. They were walking blind. 3 times they climbed a ridge, hoping to find a way down the other side, only to find a sheer cliff dropping into the sea. 3 times they had to backtrack, chopping steps into the ice, their energy draining away. By late afternoon, they were atop a razorback ridge. Night was falling. The temperature plummeted. The fog was thickening. They realized they were trapped. If they stayed on the ridge overnight, they would freeze. If they climbed down slowly, they would freeze. Shackleton looked over the edge. The slope disappeared into the mist. It was steep, terrifyingly steep. "We have to slide," Shackleton said. Worsley and Crean looked at him like he was insane. Sliding down an unknown mountain in the dark is suicide. There could be rocks at the bottom. There could be a cliff. "It's the only way," Shackleton insisted. They sat on the snow, coiled the rope beneath them like a sled, locked their arms around each other, and pushed off. They plummeted into the gray void. They accelerated. The wind screamed in their ears. They fell 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet. Whoosh! The slope leveled out. They slowed down and came to a stop in a bank of soft snow. They checked their limbs. Nothing broken. They stood up and laughed hysterically. They had descended 3,000 feet in minutes. They were alive. Chapter 9, The Fourth Man. They marched through the night.
They were hallucinating from exhaustion. They walked through a frozen waterfall. They crossed a glacial lake. Years later, all three men would recount the same strange sensation. They felt that there were not three of them, but four. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were four, not three, Shackleton wrote. T.S. Eliot would later immortalize this in his poem, The Wasteland. Who is the third who walks always beside you? Guided by this phantom presence, they kept moving. At 6:30 a.m., they heard a sound. It was a whistle. It was the steam whistle at the Stromness whaling station calling the men to work. It was the first sound of outside civilization they had heard since 1914. Never was music so sweet, Worsley said. But they had one last obstacle, a waterfall. To reach the station, they had to descend a 30-foot waterfall of freezing glacial runoff. They tied their rope to a rock. One by one, they lowered themselves through the icy cascade, gasping as the water soaked their already frozen clothes. They landed on the rocks below. They walked toward the station.
Chapter 10. The Monsters at the Door. May 20th, 1916. Stromness Whaling Station. The station manager, Torolf Sorle, was working in his house. There was a knock at the door. A worker opened it and stepped back in horror. Standing there were three creatures. Their hair hung down to their shoulders, matted with blubber and salt. Their beards were tangled nests. Their clothes were rags, black with soot from burning seal oil, held together with safety pins. They smelled of death and the sea. The manager looked at them. He didn't recognize them. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. The man in the center, despite his ragged appearance, stood with a strange dignity. "My name is Shackleton," he said softly. The manager's jaw dropped. "We thought you were dead," he whispered. "Everyone thinks you are dead." The Norwegian whalers, tough men who spent their lives slaughtering giants of the deep, gathered around. When they realized who these men were and what they had done, many of them began to weep. They took the men, bathed them, fed them, and gave them fresh clothes. That night, a severe storm struck South Georgia, a hurricane. It ripped branches off trees. Shackleton listened to the wind howling outside the warm house. He realized that if they had been on the mountain just 1 hour longer, they would have died. Chapter 11. The Rescue of the 22. Shackleton didn't rest. His body was safe, but his soul was on Elephant Island. He immediately borrowed a ship, the Southern Sky, to go get his men. He got within 70 miles of the island. The pack ice blocked him. He had to turn back. He went to Uruguay. He borrowed a trawler, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1. He got within 20 miles. The ice blocked him again. He went to Chile. He chartered a schooner, the Emma. The engine broke down. He was tossed around in storms for weeks. He failed again. It was now August. 4 months had passed since he left Elephant Island. He was terrified that Frank Wild and the men were starving. Finally, the Chilean government loaned him the Yelcho, a small steel-hulled steam tugboat. It wasn't an icebreaker, it was a tugboat, but the captain, Luis Pardo, was brave. On August 30th, 1916, the Yelcho approached Elephant Island. The fog lifted. On the beach, the 22 men were boiling seal bones for lunch. They had given up hope. They thought the boss had drowned in the James Caird. Then Marston, the artist, looked up. "Ship O! Smoke! Ship!" he screamed. The men ran out of the overturned boats. They waved their arms. They screamed. On the bridge of the Yelcho, Shackleton peered through his binoculars. He counted the tiny figures on the beach. He lowered the glasses. He turned to Worsley, tears streaming down his face. "They are all there, skipper. They are all there." Shackleton took a boat to the shore. He didn't even step on land. He just yelled, "Get in the boat! Get in the boat!" Within an hour, all 22 men were safe aboard the Yelcho. As they steamed away, the ice closed in behind them, snapping shut over the beach they had just left. Chapter 12. The Legacy. They returned to a world that had changed. While they were fighting the ice, millions of men had died in the trenches of France. The heroic age of exploration was over. The age of machine slaughter had begun. Many of the Endurance crew enlisted in World War I immediately. Tim McCarthy, who survived the James Caird voyage, was killed in action at sea 3 weeks after returning. Shackleton was never good at normal life. He drank too much. He couldn't settle down. In 1921, he organized another expedition to the Antarctic. On January 5, 1922, his ship arrived at South Georgia Island, the site of his greatest triumph. That night, suffering a massive heart attack, Sir Ernest Shackleton died in his bunk. He was 47. His wife, Emily, refused to have his body brought back to England. "He belongs there," she said. He was buried on South Georgia, among the whalers. His grave faces south, toward the ice. Epilogue: The Ghost Ship. March 5, 2022. The Weddell Sea. For 107 years, the wreck of the Endurance lay lost at the bottom of the world. A modern expedition, Endurance 22, launched advanced underwater drones to find her. They searched the coordinates Worsley had recorded in 1915. At a depth of 3,008 meters, or 9,869 feet, the cameras saw something. It was a wooden ship. It was upright. It was proud. The cold, oxygen-poor water had preserved it perfectly. The wood looked fresh. The paint was visible. And on the stern, clear as day, was the name, Endurance. Below it, a 5-pointed star. It is considered the finest shipwreck ever discovered. It is not a site of tragedy, but a monument to leadership. Shackleton failed to cross Antarctica. He failed to reach the pole. By every metric of his original mission, he was a failure. But he brought 27 men home. As one of his geologists famously wrote, "For scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton." The end.